Hello and welcome to this Chemistry World webinar. I'm Ben Valsler, Chemistry World's digital editor, and joining me, and hopefully you can see on your screen, is Rachel Dance, who's from the Cambridgeshire Deaf Association. Now, she's going to do a real-time BSL translation for us. If you find that you need her support there, then you'll find that GoToWebinar will allow you to resize the screen to make sure that you can put her exactly where you need her to make the most of what she's doing. So just drag that screen around and you'll find that you can put her exactly where you need her. Now, this is the first in a series of webinars about building a better chemistry culture. The series has been developed with the Inclusion and Diversity team at the Royal Society of Chemistry and is a monthly series designed to support the chemical sciences community in response to and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Throughout the series, we'll illuminate the science behind the issues being experienced and will provide support tailored to the needs of the chemical scientists who are sharing coping strategies and reducing the stigma around mental health and well-being. So we will be looking at flexible working, isolation and loneliness, professional and personal relationships, coping with loss, and that's not just the loss of a partner or a loved one, but also the loss of opportunities and so on, but also managing uncertainty and lack of control. But this particular webinar's theme ties in with Mental Health Awareness Week, and our theme is kindness. So we will explore how to build a better chemistry culture through the incredible impact of kindness. We'll examine examples from the chemical sciences. We've got three fantastic guests coming up. Sarah Bond, who will be talking to us about the importance of kindness. She's a consultant, advisor. She has a particular interest in culture change on diversity and inclusion. We're also joined by David Hamilton, who's talking about the science of kindness. He used to work in drug development at AstraZeneca and is now the author of several books, including, importantly, The Little Book of Kindness. And lastly, we'll be joined by Zoë Ayres, who's talking about being kind to yourself. She's an analytical research scientist and a mental health advocate. You might have seen her mental health poster series on Twitter. So that's who's coming up today. Your role in this is to sit back, enjoy. Hopefully it'll make you think, and it might make you want to ask a few questions. So the GoToWebinar software that you should have on your screen now can be resized, rearranged however you want. And you can use that to ask questions to our speakers. So there is a box on there for asking questions. Pop any question in that you like, and we will make sure that that tries to be answered, assuming we have time by all three of our guests. We will also be running a couple of polls throughout the webinar. That's just our way of getting to know you, getting to know what you understand, how you feel about the sorts of issues that we're talking about. So do please interact with that. It's really useful for us to know who you are, what sorts of things you're interested in, and where you are on these topics that we're discussing. We do tend to find that the polls don't always work if they are in full screen mode. So when the polls do pop in, you can just resize that screen and then you can answer. So that's one thing to keep an eye out for. Now that is probably quite enough from me, so I should hand over now to our very first guest, who is Sarah Bond. Now Sarah is the founder and director of For Business Sake Consulting. She's an experienced consultant, advisor, facilitator, coach and researcher with over 20 years experience of working with leaders, managers and teams in the UK, Europe and around the world to progress organizational culture change on diversity and inclusion. Sarah is passionate about inclusion and the creation of inclusive cultures at work, and so she's here to share some of that passion with us today. So Sarah, we should hopefully be able to see your webcam in just a second. Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you very much for joining us. And we're just going to get your microphone switched on now. Oh. There's inevitably technical hitches with any sort of online presentation. So hopefully we'll have Sarah back in just a second. There we go. So Sarah, we can hear you now. We can hear you. We can't yet see you though. So if you wouldn't mind switching your webcam on again, that would be really helpful.
Yes, I'm clicking on the webcam button, but it doesn't seem to be working for some reason.
Well, inevitably there are problems, and this is why we have the slide up, so at least people can see your face even if they can't directly see you talking. We have you back. That's wonderful. Thank you again for joining us. I'm going to open up with quite a broad question here. What does kindness mean to you?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ben, for that question, and hello to you and to Rachel and everybody else on the webinar. It's great to be with you, and hopefully by the end of the session you'll be able to see me as well. I mean, I think in terms of kindness, it really means a couple of things to me. First of all, it means thinking of others. So putting yourself in others' shoes, taking someone else's perspective, being empathetic, thinking of other people with warmth and generosity. So that's the first part of it. But the second part of it is that acts of kindness have explicitly in them that point about taking action. So kindness is not just about thinking, it's also about doing something. It's about translating those kind of generous, empathetic thoughts into action. I mean, after all, you can have as many kind thoughts as you like, but it doesn't really mean much if you're not putting it into practice in some way. If I think about the context of work, which is kind of my where I work, then it doesn't need to be grand gestures of kindness, but really sort of small acts of kindness make a huge difference. It could be asking colleagues how they are, or inquiring about their families, or spending time with them, sort of virtually, or hopefully in real life, offering practical support, or I don't know, helping them out with a contact, or with an idea or a network. And of course, all the other topics, Ben, that you mentioned in relation to this series also have elements of kindness in them, coping with loss, managing uncertainty, loss of control, all of those, kindness is implied in how we deal with it. I mean, just one other thing as well. So we most usually think about kindness to other people, but a really important part of kindness is about kindness to self. And I know we're going to be talking about that later. But then there's also kindness in the sense of creating a culture of kindness in society and in organizations. And I'm going to say that, whatever the context we're talking about kindness in, whether that's self or others, or in terms of a culture, it seems to me there's no more important time than now to be kind and to be focusing on kindness. So it's just a brilliant opportunity to talk about this.
It's also been a very good chance to see examples of kindness in action, people going very much out of their way to help their friends, their family, their community.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's been great. I mean, I think for me personally, community and acts of kindness in the community have been so important at this time, and it's been a great opportunity to get to know people in my community that I didn't know beforehand. We set up a WhatsApp group, for instance, and it's been lovely to see the kind exchanges on those WhatsApp groups that we didn't have previously.
Your work in general is around inclusion, diversity, organizational culture. Could you tell me a bit more about the connection between kindness and inclusion? They must be related, but they're clearly not the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just sort of step back before I look at the connection between kindness and inclusion to explain to people what we mean by diversity as well. So you mentioned diversity, inclusion, and kindness. So diversity is about uniqueness and difference. So it's about all the things that make me, and you, and some of those differences are visible and some of them are not visible. So if you think of an iceberg, there are differences like gender or age, which might be visible, and then under the surface of the iceberg, there's lots of differences. Educational background or disability or status as a parent or whatever that you wouldn't necessarily know about. So diversity refers to both the visible and the kind of invisible aspects of difference. But inclusion's about creating a culture in which people can be themselves and bring both their invisible and their visible aspects of difference to work and feel valued for all that they are. So a real sense of belonging often is how people describe a feeling of being included. And inclusion is very much about relationships and organizational culture. So then if we look at inclusion and kindness, as you said, there's lots of similarities between those. Both are about empathy, both are about the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, both are about being generous with your time and your attention. both require a degree of self-awareness. You know, am I being inclusive? Am I being kind? And neither of them are about being judgmental. I mean, I think both require you to take some action. I mean, that's true as well. Just as you can't be kind by just thinking about it, you also can't be inclusive by just thinking about it. And I think also both are often assumed to be a bit sort of soft and fluffy in terms of, you know, approaches to organizational culture, but I'm absolutely certain, and I'm not the only one, that both are, you know, make a significant difference to organizational performance. So if we look at inclusion, you know, there's plenty of evidence about the difference that inclusion makes to engagement, to motivation, to retention, to innovation. So there are some sorts of similarities. I mean, I think where they differ is that what makes people feel included is more than kindness. And a lot of the work that I've done has been about asking people, you know, so what makes you feel included in an organization? And what's interesting with that is that kindness is implied in the responses, but it doesn't really explicitly come up very much in the responses. What I find is that there are basically three things that make people feel included. One of them is about this sense of connection, you know, so a sense of connection with other people, connection with the purpose of an organization, and connection in terms of, you know, having access to the information needed to do your job. So obviously kindness is implied in that sense of interpersonal connection. The second thing that people say makes them feel included is about respect, you know, so respect for opinions, respect for difference, and respect in terms of fairness, you know, the fair implementation of policies, if you like, in an organization. And again, I would say kindness is implied in respect, but it doesn't come up. You know, people talk about the link between respect and inclusion much more than they do about the link between kindness and inclusion. And then finally, the other part of what people tell me makes them feel included is if they feel that they have a sense of a future in an organization. So if they maybe see people like themselves at the top of an organization, or they are given responsibility and accountability for work they enjoy doing. And really kindness isn't part of that at all, actually. And that sense of sort of growth in an organization. So as I say, kindness is part of what it makes it what it means to make people feel included, but not all of it. And I think there's just one other point I wanted to add as well, is that inclusion has at its heart an awareness and understanding of difference and diversity. So just back to that term. And I'm not sure that the same is true of kindness. So I would say that's another sort of slight difference between the two, but there's no doubt you know, they are very, very connected to each other.
Can kindness actually be a hindrance? Can it get in the way of an inclusive culture? Can we be too kind?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually. I mean, I'm going to say sometimes I think kindness can get in the way, and there were a couple of examples that I can think of. One is that it, you know, sometimes some people think it's not kind to talk about difference. So, you know, not it's, or, you know, that actually mentioning somebody's disability or talking about their experiences, ethnic minority, for instance, might not be kind. I mean, I actually think that not talking about those things actually renders people invisible and can contribute to them being excluded. And I'm not sure it is particularly kind anyway, but that's just one way in which I think the kind of view, you know, maybe misperceptions about what kindness is can get in the way of inclusion. I think another way is this question about intention and impact. You know, sometimes actions that are intended to be kind can end up by excluding people. So to give you an example, you know, a manager might think it would be kind not to give somebody who's come back from parental leave a very you know, potentially stretching or a stressful project to work on. But actually what that can do is, of course, exclude somebody from a piece of work which they might want to do and might be great for their career. So I think that's the sort of intention and impact question. And then I think the third way or the third way in which can get in the way is about the stereotypes around kindness, which sometimes exist in the workplace. And one of them, which is an abiding stereotype, is that women are kinder than men. And I think sometimes the impact of that stereotype can be that women aren't therefore thought of as kind of, leadership material. They're thought of as, or encouraged to go into or to take up roles that are more caring, and which fit better with the idea of kindness than maybe a leadership role, which perhaps doesn't fit so well stereotypically with the idea of kindness. But as I said, it's an abiding stereotype, and I'm really curious to know what people on this webinar think about that. So we set up a poll to ask you, actually. And Ben, do you want to talk about that?
We can do. So what we're going to do next is to run a poll, and it is a very simple question. Do you think women are kinder than men at work? Your options are yes, no, or they're both the same. I'm going to give you a few seconds here. It would be unfair as the poll has taken away Rachel. I don't want to talk too much while we're waiting for Rachel to catch up with us. So we're going to give people an opportunity to vote, and then we will close down the poll fairly shortly. 32% of people think women are kinder, 17% think they are not, and 51%, just over half of you, enough to change the fate of a country, think that people are both the same at work. So we'll close those results down now. We'll just give the cameras an opportunity to come back so that Rachel can join us again.
Yeah, so that's really interesting that almost the same. 50%, just over 50% think that men and women are the same when it comes to kindness, but nonetheless, 32% think that women are kinder. So I think so that stereotype, that idea does still exist, that women are kinder than men at work. Yeah.
It's interesting how tenacious some of these stereotypes can really be. Yes.
Absolutely.
We should move on to David very soon, but just if you can give us quite a quick answer to this one. Yeah. We talked about women in leadership roles and how those stereotypes may encourage them away from leadership roles. How important do you think kindness is in leadership?
I mean, I think that it's not typically or not always considered a leadership trait, but if I think about the leaders that I met, and particularly those who are committed to inclusion, then a lot of the behaviours that they demonstrate, I would describe as kind, whether that's sort of curiosity about others, or self-awareness, or a collaborative behaviours. Those kinds of leadership behaviours, I think, do talk to kindness in leaders as being really important.
Thank you very much. Sarah and all of our guests will stay with us to take questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please get them in to the GoToWebinar questions box now. Thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you.
Our next guest is David Hamilton. He worked in drug development at AstraZeneca for 4 years before leaving there to embark on a career as a writer and public speaker. He's now the author of several books, including The 5 Side Effects of Kindness and The Little Book of Kindness. He speaks regularly to the public at schools and in businesses about the health effects of simple kindness. That means he's very well placed to talk to us today about the science of kindness. So our next guest, David Hamilton. David, please turn your camera on. There we go. And hopefully we can hear you as well.
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes. Now, I will step back and let you take this away. But Rachel is still there for everybody who needs her. I will just cool off for a minute by pointing a fan at myself. So take it away.
Hey, hi everyone. So I want to talk a wee bit about some of the physiological effects and even the effects in the brain of being kind. And you know, this is Mental Health Awareness Week, and the theme is kindness. And it turns out that one of the side effects of kindness, I like to call them side effects. You know, we often think of a side effect in the negative. I mean, when I worked in AstraZeneca, anytime you hear a side effect, people talk about it in the negative. But actually, a side effect is really just something that happens alongside the thing that you're trying to accomplish. So it turns out there are actually 5 side effects of kindness, and I'll talk briefly about a couple of them in a moment. The first of the side effects is kindness actually improves mental health. Numerous scientific studies they ask a bunch of people to do a certain rough number of acts of kindness over a period of time. So it might be in a day, or it might be in a week, or longer. And their happiness levels are compared against people who are asked to really just go about their lives, their days as normal. And in almost all of these studies, you see the same thing. Those who do the acts of kindness experience a net gain in happiness. And then you look at longer term studies on people who have been consistently kind. And an easy way to get that kind of data is you look at people who do regular volunteer work. And what you start to see then is a protective effect against depression. You know, some sort of protection that consistently being kind offers us. Now, we used to look at the happiness boosting effects and even this protective effect against depression as really just a transient effect of something that you feel, or maybe kindness fiddles around with brain chemistry, which it does. But now we know from brain imaging techniques that it actually goes a lot deeper than that. And what can actually explain the happiness inducing effect and the protective effect against depression is the fact that being kind, because of how it feels, actually causes physical change in the structure of the brain. It's a bit like a muscle. So if you go to the gym and let's say you work out a muscle, okay, so if I worked out my bicep, I think that's the only muscle, however small, that you can see here. But if I went to the gym and worked out a muscle, then what you would see is 2 things. First thing that would happen is the muscle would become firmer, which means there's an increase in muscle fibers. And secondly, it would become larger. Now, if you work out a region of the brain, the exact same thing happens. But of course, scientists, we don't call it muscle growth in the brain. It's called neuroplasticity. So if ever you hear the term neuroplasticity, what you're really hearing is muscle growth, but applied to the brain. And what that really means is the neurons and the connections are like kind of plastic, and they mold and they change, and they really change and adapt to your experiences in life. Now, most people nowadays are familiar with the technique of mindfulness. You know, if you've never heard of it, then consider this mindfulness 101. So you simply breathe, which I hope most of you do, but let's say you breathe, and then you notice that breathing is what you're doing. Now, in the noticing that you're breathing, you're actually working out the noticing region of the brain. And it so happens that the noticing region of the brain, the area of the brain that gets worked out when you notice something consistently, when you're mindful of something, is this frontal part here, the forehead and behind the orbits of the eyes. Technically, it's called the prefrontal cortex, but it gets trained like a muscle at the gym, and it becomes denser, firmer, and it becomes larger. But what if instead of doing mindfulness, you switch the focus a little and do kindfulness? So kindfulness is like mindfulness, but as well as noticing that you're breathing, you then introduce thoughts and sentiments of kindness and compassion towards yourself and towards others. And an amazing thing happens. It turns out that you work out that whole frontal region of the brain, but there's a bias slightly to the left-hand side. It's like you're going to the gym and you work out the left-hand side slightly more than the right-hand side. Now, why that is significant is the left-hand side of this frontal region is the area associated with the experience of positive emotion, with happiness and joy and resilience and the ability to feel present and even overrule negative feelings even in stressful situations. So it seems to be that the effects of kindness on mental health in terms of inducing happiness and giving us some degree of protection against the onset of depression seems to be in the change in the physical structure of the brain. Isn't that absolutely amazing? I absolutely love that kind of stuff. But it goes even further than that, because the effects of kindness don't just hang around in the brain, they actually affect, you know, the immune system, the cardiovascular system. And in fact, as we move on to that, I'll just pose a question to you, which we're going to do a little poll again. So if I was to ask you, what is the opposite of stress? And Ben will kindly put up the poll. Then what would you say is the opposite of stress?
So what do you think? Is it peace? Is it calm? Is it kindness? Or is it being relaxed? So I can see the results on screen, David, but you can't see them yet.
Right.
What do you think most people have said?
I would say most people will probably say peace.
Interesting.
Probably.
Well, we may have slightly misled people by this being a webinar about kindness, but only 5% of people said that the opposite of stress is kindness. 15% said peace. 37 said calm, and 43 said relaxed. So people can see those results on their screen. So yes, almost half of our audience thought the opposite of stress is relaxation.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that, Ben, and thanks everyone for participating there. And I was expecting something along those lines, but in actual fact, relaxed, even calm and peace, they're not actually the opposite of stress. They're the absence of stress. Physiologically speaking, the opposite of stress is kindness. Because you think about what stress actually is. Stress is the physiological effects on the body associated with feeling stressed. It's the feelings of stress that trigger the production of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol in the brain that have these well-known effects in the body. I mean, because two people can be in the same situation, one person could be feeling stressed and the other person's going, take a chill pill, don't worry about it, everything will be fine. So the person that's feeling stressed will have high levels of stress hormones, but the person that's feeling a bit more relaxed about it will have hardly any stress hormones. So the situation itself doesn't matter quite so much, it's how you feel. So feelings of stress produce stress hormones. And this is where the physiological opposite comes in, because it turns out that when you be kind, because of how that feels, psychologists often refer to the feeling as elevation. You're in a slightly elevated state, which might feel kind of nice or warm or satisfying. If you're observing kindness, witnessing it, it could be a feeling of inspired by, a sense of moral fiber, something like that. But the overall feeling is referred to as elevation. So the feelings induced by kindness, just like feelings induced by stress produce stress hormones, feelings induced by kindness produce kindness hormones, and they really are called kindness hormones. Well, I say that because I call them that in my books, and it's really just to draw that comparison between it's the feelings, not the act itself, but the feelings that trigger the chemical products. And the main kindness hormone, incidentally, is oxytocin, the female reproductive hormone, but it also plays men have it as well, but it also plays a considerable role in the maintenance of health of your cardiovascular system. One of the most important things about it, actually, where you can see the opposite of stress, we know that stress increases blood pressure. Well, when you be kind, because of how it feels, the feelings induced by kindness turn on a little tap, and into your brain and into your body come the kindness hormone. And it turns out there are copious quantities of receptors for the kindness hormone that line your blood vessels. So what happens is the kindness hormone swims through your blood vessels, and it parks in its receptors in the lining of the blood vessels, and that triggers the production of nitric oxide. And ultimately what that does is it releases the tension in the walls of the arteries, and the artery goes like that. Even makes that sound. Yeah. No, I'm only kidding. But the blood vessel expands, and that means the heart doesn't have to push quite as hard to get the blood and oxygen through. So what you get is the heart eases off some of its pressure. So what you get is a reduction in blood pressure. So for that reason, the kindness hormone is actually called cardioprotective, meaning it protects the cardiovascular system. There's a number of other things it does as well. It acts also directly on the immune system. Research shows that kindness, again, because of how it feels, actually causes a substantial elevation in one of the most important immune system antibodies, known as secretory immunoglobulin A, or SIGA. There's a test at the end, by the way. I'm only kidding again. But so it causes an elevation in SIGA levels. It's an antibody that lines your mucous membranes in your throat, your nose, etc. So there are physiological effects of kindness, as well as these neurological, which give us that happiness and protective effect against depression. But I really want to kind of move swiftly on to one of my favorite side effects of kindness, and it's so pertinent given the times we're in right now, and it's that kindness is contagious. In fact, it's the most contagious thing. In fact, most people are familiar with the R number for the R number for this coronavirus, even at its height, was about 2.5. Roughly, give or take a little bit. What that means is one person will infect 2.5 people, and then those 2.5 in the next wave, the next interaction, will infect another 2.5 each. So that's about what, 6.25, and then each of those 6.25 will infect another 2.5 in the third wave. So what you have now is about 15.625. So about 16 people infected from one person. 2.5 times 2.5 times 2.5. The R number for kindness, believe it or not, it's somewhere between 4 and 5. In fact, it's closer to 5. And the number varies according to population density, interactions, where you work, where you live, etc. But on average, it's between 4 and 5, but closer to 5. And some research was done by scientists at Harvard and Yale, and they showed that kindness, through this contagion number, this R number, actually goes out to 3 waves, or what they call 3 degrees of separation. What that really means is when you be kind to someone, because of how that person feels, if you were to follow that person around for the rest of the day, what you would see happening, and I hope you don't follow the person, but if you did, this is what would happen. Because of how you made that person feel, that person would be kind or kinder to 5 people over the course of the rest of the day. That's where the R number of 5 comes in. But each of those 5 people will be kind or kinder to 5 further people over the next 24 hours. That's at the second wave. But at the third stage, each of those 25 will be kind or kinder to 5 further people. So what you actually get is 125 people benefiting from a single act of kindness. And I say that to you because this is Mental Health Awareness Week, and I think sometimes many of us don't realize how much of an important contribution we make. Even when you don't feel it's significant, every tiny little act of kindness you do matters. Every little thing, every thank you, every congratulations, every kind word that you say has a ripple effect. And it's actually called a ripple effect. If you drop a pebble in a pond and it goes plop, and it creates a wee wave, and the wave goes like that, and it pushes out and it pushes out, and at the other side of the pond, a wee lily pad does that. But the lily pad's got no idea why it's doing that. But it's doing that because of the wave. But what set the wave in motion was a pebble dropped in a pond. Now that's akin to an act of kindness. Every act of kindness you do, even when you don't feel it's significant, it matters to the other person. I experienced depression several years ago, and I know what it feels like. And when someone just checks in on you, just a tiny little act of kindness or compassion or consideration, it might seem small to them. It was massive to me. So don't underestimate the tiny little things that seem small to you, because they all set in motion this ripple effect. And we know scientifically, because of the R number, that kindness has this enormously contagious effect. I mean, coronavirus isn't in every household, but kindness absolutely is. So I wanted to just finish my wee session with setting you a challenge if you would like to accept it. And the challenge is this. I call it the 7-day kindness challenge. And what that means is you have to do an act of kindness every day for the next 7 days. But there's a couple of guidelines that make it a little bit more interesting and help you and others to get more out of it. So the first guideline, you have to do something different every day. So you can do the same thing twice if you want, but it only counts the first time. So for example, if you make someone a cup of tea on, let's say today, you start today, you can make someone a cup of tea on Saturday if you like it, but it doesn't count on Saturday because you've already counted making a cup of tea. So you've got to do something different on that day. So it's 7 different acts over the 7 days. Guideline number 2, try to push yourself out of your comfort zone at least once in the week. And what that means is don't always stick to just safe, easy acts of kindness. Maybe once, just give yourself, just stretch a little bit if you can, if it's appropriate. The third guideline is one of your acts of kindness has to be completely anonymous. So no one must ever know what you did. Or if people know about something, no one gets to know that it was you who did it, at least for a little while. So there you go. That's some of the neurological and physiological acts of benefits of kindness and how that is also highly contagious. And so let's start a little kindness pandemic from today. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, David. I look forward to seeing the Mexican wave of kindness that spreads out from everybody who attended this webinar. And there are lots of people here, so with an R number like that, we should hit the whole country fairly quickly. So our third and final guest for today is Zoë Ayres. Now, Zoë is an analytical research scientist in the water industry. She's also a mental health advocate working towards improving mental health in research settings. She's the author of the mental health poster series that you may have seen on Twitter. She's joined us today to talk about self-kindness and about how it's important not to forget your own mental health in all of this. Zoë, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you now, yes.
Yeah.
Often a little delay on these things. We can hear you and we can see you and we can see your presentation. So again, I'm going to sit back and enjoy this. So thank you very much.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of being kind to ourselves as chemists, primarily because I am one, so I'm an analytical scientist by background, but also because of the mental health advocacy work that I do. And I do that work really because, and I feel like it's important to say this, because during my chemistry PhD, I struggled with my own mental health. And it was during that time period that I really had to reevaluate myself both as a person, as a scientist, and really build in some self-care strategies in order to get through that time. And that's the perspective that I hope to bring today. So I'm going to start out first by just discussing some attributes that we need as chemists, and I've got some words up here. And these words come from a study run by a scientist organisation. And what they did was they went to primary school children and asked them to list off 3 attributes that you need to have as a scientist. And these are the words that came back out on top. So you can see that, and this is what I like about this study, that even at that young age, these children really knew what it was to be a scientist. They knew that we need to be passionate about our work and that we need to be creative and curious in order to solve the biggest problems of today. And they also knew that we need to be able to problem solve, although I doubt that they realised that maybe it was because we need to fix the GCMS for the 3rd time that week. And so I guess I'm doing a talk about kindness. Why am I talking about the attributes that we need as chemists? And it's relatively simple. The reason for that is that if we don't look after our mental health and we don't look after ourselves, then all of these attributes suffer. So our passion goes down, our creativity goes down, our curiosity goes down. When we experience burnout, our cognitive function is affected, and that can affect our ability to problem solve. Also, if we're no longer passionate about what we're doing, then even if we're trying as hard as we can, we may not look like we're hardworking. So if there's anything I can get you to take away from today, it's really that our mental health is really fundamentally important for us, both as chemists, but also just in our daily lives, so that we can be the best version of us. Now, while I'm talking about the attributes that we are as chemists, I thought, okay, well, actually, there are a lot of stereotypes out there, and maybe I should talk also a little bit about what we aren't. So it's going to shock some of you maybe, but we're not only interested in chemistry. There are other things we can be passionate about too. I hear a lot that we should be doing our chemistry 24/7, and there aren't many of us that are doing that. And I think that's okay. It's okay for us to be passionate about other things too. The other thing is that our value is not inherently tied only to the lab. And I don't mean this as in like you're a computational chemist, so you're never going to really be doing any wet chemistry. What I mean is that we're multidisciplinary. We work with a range of people. We have the team working skills and the ability to work with others that really makes us the chemists that we are. And then finally, we're not robots. It sounds very obvious. Sometimes our departments want us to be robots so that we can push out those papers. But we have feelings, emotions, and needs too. And if we reach burnout, then we can't achieve any of our scientific goals that we want to. And so I think it's really, really important that we consider mental health as part of ourselves and important as part of us being chemists. So for me, defining what being kind to myself is, really for me, it's building a self-care strategy or a self-care routine. And what works for one person is not necessarily going to work for another. And that's just as similar as each mental health journey is very individual, and so is self-care. But what we do find are that there are themes, or what I'm going to call elements of self-care that many people's routines contain. So we have things here like having a support network in the Erlenmeyer flask here on the left. We have things like taking medication, whether you've got a pre-existing mental health condition or whether you've got a physical illness. Actually making sure we're taking that medication helps us be mentally well. There's also things like actually doing exercise. There's a big relationship between doing exercise and actually being healthy and mentally as well. And also finding other interests outside of chemistry. It's important for me to mention here at this point as well that self-care requires a lot of trial and error. You might try something first time and it might not work for you, so you have to try something else. The other thing that's inherent with self-care is privilege. So not all of us have the same access, either financially or with time, to actually do a full self-care strategy. You know, we can't all go to a spa on the weekend. And so sometimes it's about carving out 5 minutes of our day to be calm and well and use that time appropriately. The other thing is that we go through periods of good and bad self-care. So I think often I'm also guilty of this. When I'm like rushing for deadlines and things, like I'm thinking, okay, I've got this big deadline on Friday. What I might do is say, actually, I'm not going to go do my exercise this week. And whilst in the short term, I've learned now, in the short term that works. In the long term, I really need that exercise to make me feel better and also to make me be as productive as possible. So it's about balancing that self-care strategy so that it works for you. And then also, we also have to understand that self-care is dynamic. We often have to reevaluate our routines. And we've got like the perfect example right now with the pandemic, in the sense that what worked for you for self-care two months ago might not necessarily work for you right now. So we really have to think about our self-care strategy and how we might modify that. And so for the remainder of the talk, what I'm going to do is just talk about a few elements of self-care routines that are quite common themes throughout people's self-care routines. And you'll see here, and on some of the other slides, that I've got some tweets from people. And so what I did was I went to the community on Twitter and said, well, what are you doing for your self-care strategies now? So these tweets will be featured on these slides. I'm not going to read them word for word, but please do read through them, and the slides will be available after the talk. What I really wanted to illustrate was just how personal our self-care strategies are, and just the range of things that are available for you to do and think about. So talking about physical health or exercise, it sounds very obvious, but finding a sport that works for you is really important, because if you hate doing it, you're not going to maintain that routine. The other thing is, people often talk about whether or not they can fit exercise in at all, and we all need lunch breaks. If you're not taking a lunch break, that's self-care in itself. Please put one in. You take 15 minutes and go for a walk. There's other things you can do, like park in a car park slightly further away from your office than you would usually do, or at the top of a multi-story car park, and do that and just build that exercise into your day. And there's something I'm really guilty of, so I'm going to mention here, like a lot of us are chemists working in a wet lab. maybe we're not actually drinking. So sometimes I'll go for 3 or 4 hours and not actually drink anything in my lab. So this is a reminder for me just as much as maybe it's a reminder for you. And so there's all sorts of different things people are doing here in these tweets. At the moment with the pandemic, for example, Tanya here on the right is doing her cycle commute to work, and she's going straight there and straight back, and keeping that commute in place, but not actually going into the office. And Jelena here talks about working from home and the backache a lot of people have been talking about, and actually doing some yoga poses to ease that off. Other things that you can do outside of work are really important, so having time for hobbies. So it's really, really important as chemists that we find some self-worth outside of chemistry, because science, quite frankly, often doesn't work. And so sometimes when you get home, it's just really nice to be able to do something that you can make work and understand that. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that your hobby does not have to be social media worthy. You can just do a hobby to enjoy it. And so there's all sorts of different things people do here, from Jennifer up here doing sewing, to Tim growing chilies, to Wendy watching Disney movies. And I think that's, there's such a range of things that you can do to enjoy yourself. There's also an important point down here by Michael in the right-hand corner. That a lot of us have felt pressured into like maybe starting up hobbies again because of the pandemic, because we've got so much more time in inverted commas. And actually, maybe if you're starting a hobby and you're not enjoying it, it's okay, don't do it. And so now moving on to a support network as part of a key element of self-care, and this is really, really important to me. When we reach out to people, it allows us to kind of alleviate some of the load that we have, whether that's friends, family, or professionals. There are people out there that can help you, even if you don't feel like you can right now. There are all sorts of different great online communities as well if you can't speak to someone around you. The other thing that I really want to mention is that the people that you work with are most likely to be experiencing similar stresses to you. And by reaching out to them, if you feel able, you might not only help yourself, but also help them as well. So I think that's really important to consider. And then talking a little bit about self-compassion. So we set ourselves goals and targets. Where we're scientists, we're naturally driven by goals and targets. We want to get and find the next best thing. But for self-care to work, when we're actually building in a routine, we have to be willing to forgive ourselves if we don't hit our targets or goals. I think it's also really important to mention that we can be our worst enemies, holding ourselves to standards that we wouldn't necessarily hold other people to. We can always be kinder to other people than we might be to ourselves, and sometimes we need to check that a little bit and be like, am I being realistic about myself? And something particularly related to the pandemic right now that I would like to share and say is, try at the moment not to compare yourself to pre-COVID you. And by that I mean that your productivity 2 months ago, you shouldn't be comparing yourself to that right now because the circumstances have changed. So just letting go of some of that guilt. There's some really nice examples of self-compassion here, like journaling and blogging, actually just remembering that there's tomorrow, and you can start something new then. And also Lindsay up here on the right, actually creating a list of daily challenges, but not having the list as something to do with work, but some daily challenges to help with mental health. And so I really just wanted to talk very briefly about some of the things that have helped me throughout my chemistry career thus far. And these are kind of like things that I live by and kind of want to pass on a little bit. One of them is letting go of the guilt. And by that I mean, I need downtime. I need the weekends to recover. I perform better when I've had time off. I've really had to wrestle with that guilt of taking time off, but it's really important that we do. The other thing is learning to say no. So as an early career researcher particularly, if an opportunity comes up, we probably want to try and grab it because we're worried that if we don't, then our career might suffer. But what I can say to you is that if you take on so many things that you're only doing everything at 50%, then there's really no point in you doing them at all. So sometimes it's really important to say no. Another thing that I personally struggle with is perfectionism. So again, particularly during the pandemic as well, I think we really need to focus on progress, not perfection, that we're moving forward in the right direction. And then finally, really for me, and because chemistry is so metrics orientated, which I hope will change a little bit with time, is really to stop comparing yourself with others. Like someone's science project is not necessarily going to equate to yours, there's an inherent amount of luck associated with chemistry, and comparing ourselves just really doesn't help with our own mental health. And if you're doing your best, then that is good enough. And so finally, I really just wanted to conclude with how I feel that we can build a better culture in chemistry. And for me, it's simple. We need to be kind to ourselves and to others. We've talked about that today, and the feeling of being kind to others and how that helps us as well. The other thing is that we really need to understand that mental health is just as important as physical health. And that's not just as individuals. And there's something that I haven't really talked about in this talk, is that no matter how resilient you are by building a self-care strategy, if the environment you're working in is not okay and is not conducive to mental health, then you're not going to thrive in that environment. So we also have to work on an institutional level to induce change. And this is what this sort of webinar, I hope, is going to start to bring about. And ultimately, we need to work together to build a better culture. And that has to be together. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Zoe. That was Zoë Ayres. Incredibly important topic. And obviously, in our case, it does apply to chemists, but it applies to everybody, really. Everybody has stresses and strains at work, regardless of whether they're a scientist or a sales manager or a gardener. So I think they're valid, useful life lessons for everybody there. Now, we do have a few minutes for some of your many questions that have come in. So what we'll do now is we'll ask everybody if they could share their webcams again, so we can put all of these questions to as many of you as possible. We're really sorry if we don't get to answer any of your questions. Thank you for sending them in. I strongly encourage you to ask your friends, ask your social networks, get these conversations started, because they are important conversations to be had. And we have created an opportunity here to get you thinking about those questions, but that doesn't mean that we're the only people who can answer them for you. If you have questions about kindness, about stress at work, talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your colleagues, talk to your management, talk to HR at work. People are out there to talk to about this, so do please go and get those conversations started. But I've picked out a couple that I'd like to go through with the panel. Zoe, seeing as you went last, I'll let you go first on the questions. Do you think, this is a question from Kanaya Rona, do you think the academic environment is conducive to good mental health? And is there anything that we could do to make it better?
So at the moment, I think there's a lot of stigma around mental health at the moment, and we really need to work more to actually talk about the mental health strains that a lot of us experience, and that we really need to work together, and it needs to be both a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach to that. So actually having leaders come forward and say, actually, this is a thing that I experience too. I think so often in academia, there's people are on a pedestal, and it's really hard to kind of, those people are struggling too, just it's not as visible. And I think that we really need to improve that visibility.
And that, of course, is one of the things we're trying to do here, try and open up those conversations, try and deal with some of the stigma. David, we've had a few questions along these lines, but I'm going to summarize them. And I think probably the person who got closest to the heart of the question was Tony Long. Tony, thank you for your question. Can people be trained to be kind?
Absolutely. In fact, you know, we all have they call it the kindness gene. In fact, the gene for the receptor gene for the kindness hormone is one of the oldest in the human genome. It's about 500 million years old and 4.5 days. But it's ancient. So everyone has it. There's variation in the gene, you know, how strong it binds. So there's some variation that affects that person's natural tendency to be kind given the same set of circumstances. But within that, people's natural tendency is affected. It's increased and decreased as they go through their lives due to, you know, experiences that we have, early experiences, for example, experiences at school, in a professional environment, culture itself, what we learn. So what's happening is we're learning to be more kind, and we're forgetting to be kind. So it is absolutely learnable, like anything. And I come back to what I was saying about the neurological effects. One of the studies got people to practice It's a Tibetan Buddhist mindfulness practice called loving kindness. You basically think of people in your life and go, may you be happy, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be at peace. And that caused physical change in 2 different regions of the brain. And other studies show that that actually leads sometimes to a change in a person's behavior. And so what you're actually seeing is there is evidence to say we really can learn to be more kind, just that we can have experiences that can suppress the natural tendency a little bit.
Thank you very much. Sarah, again, a couple of people asked this question. Shyam Lal, I think, was the first one. How do you think the culture of kindness differs around the world?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, actually. I imagine that there are significant differences in terms of what's considered kindness in different cultures. I'm just thinking about the point I was talking about before, about talking about difference and diversity. You know, so in different cultures, maybe politeness is thought of as kind, and politeness, as in not talking about difference, might be thought of as kind. So I can imagine there are. I mean, I think that kindness is culturally, to some degree, culturally specific, and to some degree universal is probably what I would say. I mean, given what David was saying about the way that it affects our brains, I imagine that's universal. But how it's expressed, perhaps, differs in different cultures.
I think we've got time for one quick one. I'll ask this to all of you, but let's go. David, Zoe, Sarah, do you think that our shared experience of COVID-19, of lockdown, of the huge cultural changes that are happening, is going to instill more kindness and compassion, in particular in terms of mental health, or do you think we'll see a different reaction?
For me, I would definitely say more. In fact, you can see it. I mean, I don't think I've ever witnessed so much kindness globally taking place in the world at any other time. So I'm very, very hopeful that we will see an increase in kindness and compassion everywhere.
Thank you, Zoe.
So I'll be brief with this. I think the answer is yes, but we also are going to have to work that we don't forget the kindness that we're doing right now when we progress beyond coronavirus. And I think there's going to be some real work there to maintain the traction that we're getting in this area.
To make sure that the new normal is a better normal.
Exactly.
And Sarah, I'll let you have final word on this. What do you think the post-COVID kindness landscape will be?
I mean, I tend to agree with Zoe. I've seen enormous acts of kindness by leaders and managers over the past few weeks, and I really hope that those inclusive and kind leadership behaviours stay in place when we get, well, whatever the next phase is. I was going to say when we get back to normal, whatever the next phase is. And I think there will be work needed to make sure that that happens.
Fantastic. Well, thank you ever so much. So everybody, please join me in saying a huge thank you to Sarah Bond, David Hamilton and Zoe Ayres for joining us today, and to Rachel Dance, who's been doing our BSL interpretation as well. Just before we go, I'd like to highlight a few resources from the RSC and some others that may be useful that relate to some topics we've been talking about today. So the Chemists Community Fund is the benevolent fund of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and they have an objective of relief and prevention of poverty for RSC members, their partners and dependents. So you can see the link on screen there now, rsc.ly/CCF Health, to learn more about the Chemist Community Fund and further resources to support you and others during the COVID-19 pandemic. For those who are watching the webinar live, in the GoToWebinar panel handouts section, you'll find a PDF of a postcard. You can download that. That signposts you to other things that the Community Fund does and other resources available. Also on screen, the Royal Society of Chemistry Bullying and Harassment Support Line provides impartial support for anyone affected by or concerned about bullying and harassing behaviour in the chemical sciences. So that's 0800 520 0115. That's a free phone UK number. Do use that. It's fairly recently set up and we're really proud to be running it. So do give that a call if you do have any concerns. And of course, mental health support is available through the Samaritans free helpline called 116 123 in the UK, or by text through Shout, which is at 852 258. So those resources are there if you need them at any time. And that's it. So the next webinar in this series, the Building a Better Chemistry Culture series, will be on flexible working, the challenges and the opportunities that come from working away from your colleagues or spending time away from the lab. We do still have some details to be confirmed, but you can register your interest right now at rsc.ly/flexible work webinar, and then we'll be able to send you updates when we know who we've got, exactly what the time is and so on, and make sure that we keep you up to date. And that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for so many of you for joining us. This is experimental for us. We've been very delighted to have Rachel with us. It makes a real difference, I think, in making our webinars as accessible as possible. This is the first in a series. I think they're only going to get better, and we're off to a really, really good start. So finally, an extra thank you to Sarah Bond, David Helmonton, and Zoe Ayres. I'm Ben Valsler, Chemistry World's digital editor. Chris Smith, our digital content, Chris Pink, our digital content producer, has been manically working away in the background to keep everything running smoothly. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We hope we'll see you next month as we continue together to build a better chemistry community.